Being the first person to do something, especially in the history of a nation, is generally considered to be a big deal. The title of first often comes with prestige and generally a place within our history books, whether it's the first prime minister, the first person on the moon, or the first person to win an online argument, something that hasn't happened yet. These pioneers often set the example and expectations for the people that come after them. The story of Akiyama Toyohiro is a little bit different though. Sometimes referred to as an anti-hero, Akiyama's accession to the titles of first Japanese person in space, as well as first space tourist, were not without their ups and downs. Despite Akiyama's accomplishments, there are very few articles out there detailing his experience, especially in English. I really had to put my bachelor's degree in Japanese and my certificate in Russian to work in making this video. So if you enjoy, please like and subscribe because it will help me to make knowledge more accessible to a wider audience. I also have student loans to pay. Come explore with me as we examine Akiyama's life, as well as his brief but somewhat chaotic tour of the cosmos. All of my sources are, of course, linked in the description. Part 1. School wasn't in the stars. Toyohiro Akiyama was born in Setagagaku, Tokyo, on the 22nd of June 1942, to a relatively modest upbringing. Among the stories that Toyohiro Akiyama has told since he returned to Earth, he has recounted that he didn't even have the intention to go to high school, let alone to go to space. This was in part due to his desire to go straight into the workforce after junior high school, in order to support his family, which was struggling financially. His family's financial struggle was only exacerbated by the fact that his father was fired around the time that he graduated junior high school. At that time, I thought about becoming an apprentice to become a rakugo artist. Rakugo being a form of traditional Japanese storytelling. But I remember being severely scolded by my mother, saying, "Don't think about that." Fortunately, I had relatives who supported me, and I was able to go to high school and university. I was grateful that International Christian University, which I enrolled in, had a scholarship system that was given to families with low incomes, taking into account the financial situation of the family at the time. At university, I was fascinated by the history of Japan's thought, and in the Edo period. I read with enthusiasm the idea of direct cultivation by Masamasu Ando, and in the Showa period, books on agrarianism by people such as Gondo Narisato and Tachibana Kozaburo. This appreciation for traditional Japanese thought is something that would follow Akiyama throughout his life, despite circumstances that discouraged him from going after his intellectual pursuits. Upon graduating from International Christian University with a bachelor's degree in social science in 1966, he was actively discouraged from going to graduate school by one of his advisors who said he wasn't suited for academics, a claim that he would probably come to regret later on considering Akiyama's career. Akiyama was influenced by the idea that traditional print media was going out of style, and he wanted to contribute to the world in a different way. Akiyama went on to work for BBC World Service at first, and then later for the Japanese broadcaster Tokyo Broadcasting Services as a news anchor. Akiyama was notably one of the first reporters from a non-communist country to visit and report from Vietnam after the Vietnamese War. During his time with TBS, he was a correspondent in Washington, D.C., where he started to cement his already existing personal philosophy about authority and the state of the world in relation to his job. In his own words, "Ever since I was a student, I have genuinely thought that power and the social system were wrong. The origin of journalists is anti-authority." Akiyama spent his free time in a kitchen garden, believing that growing food was a fundamental aspect of human life that connected humanity with the world around it, and demonstrated the perseverance of the human spirit to continue living despite its circumstances. He was also able to build relationships with foreign diplomats in Washington, D.C. by gifting some of the vegetables that he grew himself, kind of like an agrarian diplomat. In February of 1972, Akiyama's perspective on television and media in general would change even further. Following a political dispute, the Japanese Communist League Red Army seized control of the Asama Sanso mountain lodge owned by Kawai Music Instruments Manufacturing in Nagano Prefecture. Due to infighting within the leftist movement, which I could never imagine today, the group ended up purging 14 members, leaving them dead, along with one non affiliated bystander. The wife of a lodgekeeper was kept hostage as the police standoff lasted 10 days, only ending on February 28th when police finally raided the lodge. This event was notable in the history of television in Japan, as news coverage of the final day of the incident was considered to be Japan's first marathon live broadcast, lasting 10 hours and 40 minutes. Akiyama often cites this event as the reason why he continued being a journalist. He was enamored with the spectacle of it all, and people's reaction to it. As the 1970s came to a close, Akiyama came together with a few other academics to form the Joint Conference of Future Pioneers. This group was dedicated to investigating problems of industrialized society from a scientific perspective. Akiyama's insistence in studying human nature is something that would persist throughout the rest of his career, as a new opportunity arose not too long after. Akiyama's employer, TBS, is still considered to be one of the most influential news networks in Japan. By the time Akiyama was in his 40s, TBS decided that they would take advantage of a surge in revenue that came with Japan's economic bubble. In the 1980s, the television network decided to do the unthinkable and send a reporter to space in commemoration of 40 years of being on the air. TBS decided to do so with the help of an unlikely ally, the USSR.
Part 2: The Space Race, Soyuz, and Smokes.
This is where the story starts to get interesting, though. Japan had already agreed to collaborate with the United States on a joint space mission in 1985. Mori Mamoru, who was a chemistry PhD, was selected as the participant in the opportunity aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour, along with two other Japanese astronauts, with the official sponsorship of the Japanese government and the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency. At the time, nearly everyone believed that these people would be the first Japanese people to be in space. But we already know that that didn't pan out. The 1986 Challenger disaster resulted in Mamoru's flight being delayed significantly, as it was originally slated to take place in 1988. Due to Japan's constitution, which significantly limited its military capacity, the development of its own space program was similarly limited. Japan was the fourth nation to ultimately launch a satellite into orbit in 1970. But because Japan was legally binded by its constitution to not develop militarily, it didn't have as much of an incentive to pursue innovation in space technology. Universities, small scale government entities, and corporations worked together to continue launching satellites and conduct research. However, strapping a human to a rocket and launching them into the void was still a little bit out of reach. Meanwhile, TBS had over 500 applicants for its space program, with Akiyama being one of them. In the final selection stage, with only 21 applicants left, Akiyama was ultimately rejected due to having an ulcer on his stomach. Doctors from the Soviet Union came to examine the final 7 candidates, but all 7 of them were ultimately rejected for various reasons, giving Akiyama another shot.
When the time comes, Lady Luck will appear. That was Mari Yonehara, who was working as a Russian interpreter at TBS at the time and later became a writer. Ms. Yonehara strongly recommended me. That woman had a bad personality, was stubborn and cynical. and she recommended that I would be perfect for an astronaut. It would seem that the Russians liked that type of person.
And boy, would the world come to see just how cynical Akiyama could be. The final deciding factor which made Akiyama the prime candidate for the position was that he didn't have a single decayed tooth. Forget the years of journalism experience or the ability to handle extreme pressure, or even general health. They really cared about those dental records for some reason. Considering the fact that most sources that I've read have said that Akiyama was a 4 pack a day smoker at the time, it's kind of anomalous that they chose him for this position. I also mention that because it actually becomes really important to this story later. The Soviet Union previously became the first nation to launch a space station into Earth's orbit with the launch of Salyut 1 in 1971. 15 years later, they launched the Mir space station into orbit. Akiyama was planned to board the space station Mir alongside 2 Soviet cosmonauts, Viktor Afanasyev and Musa Manarov. Akiyama began his 14-month training in the October of 1989 on the outskirts of Moscow at the Gagarin Memorial Cosmonaut Center. The training was much more physically demanding than he anticipated, though. He ended up losing 15 kilograms during this time. One source even claims that the most strenuous exercise that Akiyama ever did before this point was lifting a cigarette to his mouth. Akiyama also had a particularly hard time learning Russian, even though he was unexpectedly praised by the Soviets. To be fair, if he could say the words comrade and vodka with decent enough pronunciation, I think that would have been enough. It's worth questioning at this point why the Soviets and TBS were so ready to collaborate with each other. The USSR had established Glavkosmos in 1985 in order to promote the usage of Soviet space technology for commercial purposes, with a foreign market in mind. The Soviet Union was literally 1 year away from a total collapse of its government due to a variety of factors, including a struggling economy that was desperate for foreign investment. Lest we remember the Gorbachev Pizza Hut incident.
Это Горбачев.
Горбачев.
Это из-за него у нас в экономике бардак.
Да благодаря ему у нас новые возможности.
Это из-за него у нас политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Полный хаос.
Перспективы.
Политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть Pizza Hut.
Yes, it's real, and no, I don't want to talk about it. It's safe to assume that Lenin had already rolled over in his grave multiple times at this point anyway. So when a chance came to slap some corporate logos on a rocket and send a random Japanese guy into space for some yen, they took it. The mission was funded by various private corporations within Japan, most notably Sony and Otsuka Pharmaceuticals, with the logos of those sponsors appearing on the Soviet spacecraft itself. The full details of the USSR's deal with TBS aren't widely available, but it's purported that the USSR ended up paying for more than half of the journey. The most credible source that I could find from the time quoted the whole expedition at around 5 billion yen, or around 41 million US dollars today. In his later years, Akiyama had a different perspective on this issue, stating that he believed that the United States and Western democracies were covertly funding the Soviet Space Agency in an attempt to keep the nation afloat. But even the reporter that he spoke to when he made these comments kind of laughed that off, so I would kind of take it with a grain of salt. At long last, the day finally came for Akiyama to make history on December 2nd, 1990, when he boarded the Soyuz TM-11, destined for the stars. The entire event was televised on TBS with a program called First for Japan, Into Space. About half of Japan's population tuned in to watch the event in Japan's Kanto region, with 44.5% of televisions on the station at the time of the launch. To this day, many Japanese people still recount how momentous of an occasion this event was, and reflect upon it nostalgically. Today marks the 30th anniversary. When I was a child who loved space, I was cheering while watching this live broadcast. They were doing a special every day in prime time until Mr. Akiyama came back, and it was really amazing. The theme song of the show was Save Our Ship by Yumi Matsutoya. Tetsuya Chikoshi was also a local commentator. I remember watching it as if I were devouring it when I was in high school, and I still have almost all the videotapes I recorded at that time. Akiyama contemplated for a very long time what his first words in space would be, but in his somewhat cynical nature, he famously uttered the words, "Kore, honban desu ka?" Is this the real thing? He had originally planned to say, "Uchu wa konton to shitemasu." The universe is chaotic. But upon seeing that the universe wasn't as chaotic as he anticipated, he changed his words in the last moment. Those words became infamous in Japanese media, and they would encapsulate his experience to a surprising degree. As the comments I read earlier alluded to, this program continued to air daily on TBS until Akiyama's return. Once the Soyuz successfully brought its crew onto the Mir space station, the Soviet crew gifted Akiyama with a sash that read, "Japan's First." In a classical example of Soviet oversight, they actually gifted the sash to him upside down, because none of the crew members knew how to speak Japanese. The launch was successful and a cause for national celebrations across Japan and the Soviet Union alike. Akiyama would soon realize that the universe actually was quite chaotic, but not in the way that he had originally anticipated.
Part 3. From National Hero to Anti-Hero.
On average, 1 in every 3 people tuned in to the daily broadcasts that showed Akiyama's adventures in space, making it one of the most watched events in Japanese television history. During these broadcasts, Akiyama conducted various experiments in space, including using a ball and cup to demonstrate gravity, and also releasing frogs on board his space vessel to test how they'd adapt to moving in zero gravity. The results? Well, the frogs ended up having a better time than he did. Akiyama was booked and busy during his time circling Earth, with an obligation to make his daily broadcast from space interesting enough to keep TBS's ratings worth the investment they put into the project, which put an immense strain on him. This pressure was only amplified by the fact that Akiyama experienced extreme space sickness not too long after taking off. One Soviet cosmonaut even said that they'd never seen someone throw up so violently in their entire life. As much as Akiyama tried to engage his audience, it became increasingly clear that he wasn't enjoying his time in space, often looking kind of disinterested in what he was presenting about. He was visibly uncomfortable during the whole affair, and had a hard time even staying still in zero-G during his reportings. Akiyama had a number of other complaints, including that the food served to him out of cans by the Soviets was too flavorful and overly spicy. Akiyama also, somewhat amusingly, continually bemoaned the fact that he didn't have cigarettes or beer in space. I just know my dude probably would have loved Zins. I do kind of wonder, though, if Akiyama would be an upper decky or lower decky kind of guy. Anyway, the press really grabbed on to Akiyama's cynicism in space, with some American publications even calling him an anti-hero at this point. Other American publications, though, were less poetic, and they described Akiyama as a whiskey-swilling idiot. A significant amount of American media at the time sought to diminish the scientific value of Akiyama's journey, dubbing him as a tourist. What I'm kind of getting at is that the biggest takeaway from the Americans' perception of Akiyama's journey is that when you're the first person to do something, you're bound to be criticized. Even if Akiyama was just a tourist visiting space for a few days, that's still a big deal. Today, we have companies like Elon Musk's SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactic, which all advertise their ability to send the average Joe or Jane into space. Space tourism is an untapped industry which many scientists and businessmen alike agree has massive future potential. In the words of University of New Mexico professor Emeritus Duran Gibson, Armadillo Aerospace, Bigelow Aerospace, Eads Austrian, Xcor Aerospace, UP Aerospace, and the Transformational Space Corporation, known as T-Space. More than 100 companies announced plans to enter the civilian space race, but few have survived. Even if this trip didn't significantly contribute to our understanding of space from a scientific perspective, I would argue that it was notable in the history of humanity. Today, Russia is still the only nation which has successfully utilized their existing space infrastructure to launch commercial flights since Akiyama's voyage, which is either impressive or terrifying considering how strapped Russia has been for cash since the 90s. Akiyama later reflected on space tourism himself. I was invited to more than 200 schools to deliver speeches on my experience of spaceflight. I was asked many questions every time. Among them, the question, when will ordinary men and women be able to fly, was the most common. I was sorry to answer that probably not before the 2010s. I am really sorry to say this, because I am not a special person, but exactly the same as those who asked me the question. One thing that persistently sticks out to me is how humble Akiyama is when he gives interviews. 7 days after takeoff, Akiyama successfully returned to Earth on December 10, 1990. Landing at the same location he was launched from in the Kazakhstani Soviet Socialist Republic. The first words that Akiyama uttered when he came back from his mission were about cigarettes and beer and how much he wanted them. Akiyama mentioned cigarettes so much during the broadcast and during public interviews that TBS actually had to come out and say that they weren't sponsored by any tobacco corporations. My guy was just fiending for nicotine. Akiyama returned to Japan almost as a celebrity, soon publishing his brief article, The Pleasure of Spaceflight, in the Journal of Space Technology and Science, where he reflected on his time circling the Earth. A bold title, considering that the most pleasurable part of his experience was probably touching down to Earth and lighting up a cigarette. Little did he know that the turbulence of his time in space would soon be replaced by the turbulence of the 21st century. Part 4. Akiyama's later life and legacy. Before the launch, I had a strong feeling that the Earth is such a beautiful thing, and the Earth is a mass of life. When I saw the Earth from the space station mirror, I was greatly moved, thinking, yes, what I was thinking was not wrong. I was reminded that you must tackle global environmental issues head on. Akiyama Toyohiro was then awarded the USSR's People's Friendship Award and later the Russian Federation's Award for Merit in Space. Akiyama retired from his position as a news reporter with TBS in 1995 to continue his studies in agriculture. He cited that he was disillusioned with power structures and corporations in general. It seemed that exploring the cosmos not only confirmed Akiyama's ideas about the preciousness of the Earth, but reinforced his ideas as well. I kind of wonder if Katy Perry will come back from space with similar insights. Akiyama moved away from the urban environment of Tokyo to the more rural Fukushima prefecture, where he started a mushroom farm. As a fellow enjoyer of mushrooms myself, I can't really blame the guy. Since then, Akiyama has written several books and articles on the topic of agriculture, including the titles The Hoe in the Spaceship and Space and Earth, Toward a Life with Agriculture. His peaceful life as a rural farmer didn't last for very long, though. Due to the Fukushima nuclear disaster of 2011, Akiyama had to relocate from his home in the nearby Tamura city to Gunma Prefecture. The disaster, which was caused by an earthquake, resulted in the deaths of more than 20,000 people and the displacement of even more as a result of nuclear radiation. Akiyama soon joined the faculty of Kyoto University of the Arts, where he created a new course entitled Touching the Earth, which blended his love of science with his profound appreciation of nature. Akiyama has characterized himself as a nuclear refugee as a result of this event. Today, Akiyama is still a climate activist, especially focused on educating the public on the dangers of nuclear power. A lot of Akiyama's work to this day focuses on the lack of accountability governments and corporations take for environmental devastation and mass deaths as a result of that. Akiyama has stressed that these institutions, especially in Japan, have been protected through legislation. According to Akiyama, they've successfully been able to wave off criticism and manipulate their public perception through monetary means and through falsifying numbers. It may sound tedious, but the Fukushima nuclear accident is not just a natural disaster, but also a man-made disaster caused by politicians and bureaucrats, and there is a possibility that it will be repeated. In terms of learning, we live in an era where surveillance of politicians, bureaucrats, technologists, and corporations by ourselves is more important than anything else. Today, Akiyama remains an organic farmer, living in Mie Prefecture in Japan's Kansai region. In addition to continuing his work as an activist, he occasionally gives interviews and has endorsed political candidates running in Japanese elections, which are in line with his commitment to the environment. Since retiring to a more relaxed lifestyle, to the surprise of everyone, including myself, Akiyama has given up smoking. One of the reasons why I wanted to dive deeply into Akiyama's life is because we often fall into the trap of thinking that history is only made by great men. The Scottish essayist Thomas Carlyle stated in 1940 that the history of the world is but the biography of great men. Despite this theory being criticized since then, most notably by Leo Tolstoy in his novel War and Peace, this idea is still influential, and we see it playing out in real time with our media, which points to the leadership of nations and major corporations as potential saviors to an increasingly corrupt and morally bankrupt society. Some individual leaders sell the idea of being great men who are changing history for the betterment of humanity, when in reality, we know that very often they only reinforce and exacerbate the existing problems that we face in an industrialized society. Akiyama wasn't a billionaire, or a prime minister, or a CEO. He was a farmer, a journalist, and a chain smoker who just so happened to become Japan's first astronaut. Rather than utilizing his influence as a stepping stone to celebrity, as he very well could have done, he chose to address problems he saw with a newfound truth that he couldn't ignore, which still makes him a great man in my book. On that note, I want to leave you with one final quote from Akiyama, which pretty much summarizes my feelings on the topic. Many people have realized that something is wrong and feel that action is needed now. I believe that this awareness is where hope for the future resides. If you made it to the end of this video, I just want to thank you and let you know that I'm working on a few more projects that I think you'll enjoy even more than this one. If you'd like to stay updated on future projects that I'm working on, don't forget to subscribe. Until then though, stay safe out there, Space Cadets.